Why did France control so much of Africa? The untold story of French colonial expansion. In the late 19th century, Africa became the center of one of the most dramatic power struggles in world history. European nations, driven by ambition, fear, and greed, rushed to claim African land in what later became known as the Scramble for Africa. Among all these powers, one country stood out for the sheer size of its African empire: France. By the early 20th century, France controlled nearly one-third of Africa, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. But how did this happen? Why did France gain so much land compared to other European nations? The answer lies in history, politics, military strategy, and long-term national ambition. France after Napoleon, a nation seeking glory. Again, after the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1815, France lost much of its power and prestige in Europe. Britain emerged as the world's dominant empire, while France struggled with internal revolutions and political instability. French leaders believed that overseas expansion was the key to restoring national pride. Colonies were seen as symbols of greatness. Africa, still largely independent but militarily weaker, appeared to be the perfect opportunity.
France did not want to fall behind Britain. Colonies meant power, and power meant survival in a competitive Europe.
The scramble for Africa begins in the 1880s. European nations began aggressively claiming African territory. To avoid war among themselves, they held the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. Not a single African leader was invited. At this conference, Europe divided Africa on maps. Borders were drawn without regard to tribes, languages, or cultures. Any European nation that could effectively occupy land could claim it. France came prepared. France's master strategy: land over wealth. Unlike Britain, which focused on rich coastal areas and trade routes, France aimed for land, huge amounts of it. French planners dreamed of a massive empire running from Senegal in West Africa, across the Sahara, to Djibouti in East Africa. This east-west strategy allowed France to connect territories and dominate the African interior, even if those lands were not immediately profitable. Size mattered more than money, military power, and forceful expansion. France used its army extensively in Africa. French officers led brutal military campaigns against African kingdoms and tribes who resisted. Advanced weapons, such as machine guns, modern rifles, artillery gave France an overwhelming advantage. Resistance was crushed, villages were destroyed, and traditional power structures were dismantled. Any opposition was labeled as rebellion and eliminated. Divide and rule, using local allies. France often avoided fighting large wars by using local rulers against each other. They signed treaties with chiefs, often under pressure, promised protection in exchange for loyalty, turned rival tribes into enemies. Once control was secured, those promises were usually broken. This method allowed France to expand rapidly with fewer soldiers. The French colonial system: direct rule. Unlike Britain's indirect rule, France believed in direct control. Their goal was not just to rule Africa, but to turn Africans into French subjects. This policy was called assimilation. French colonies were governed by French officials, forced to use the French language, taught French history and culture, expected to abandon local traditions. In theory, Africans could become French. In reality, equality was almost never granted. Economic exploitation. French Africa was used to supply raw materials, cheap labor, agricultural products. Africans were forced to work on plantations, build roads and railways, serve in the French army. Taxes were imposed, and failure to pay often led to punishment or forced labor. France benefited enormously, while African societies suffered. African soldiers in European wars. During World War I and World War II, France recruited hundreds of thousands of African soldiers. They fought and died for France in European wars, yet returned home to poverty, racism, continued colonial rule. Their sacrifices were largely ignored. Why other powers didn't take more land? So why didn't other European countries take as much African land as France? Britain focused on trade routes, not land size. Germany arrived late and lost its colonies after World War I. Belgium controlled Congo but focused on one region. Portugal lacked resources to expand widely. France, however, had strong military presence, long-term strategy, willingness to control vast, difficult territories, the long shadow of French colonialism. Even after independence in the 1950s and 1960s, France maintained influence through military bases, economic control, political pressure. This system is often called France-Afrique. Many former French colonies still use French currency systems, depend on French military support, face instability rooted in colonial borders. The beginning of the end of empire. By the mid-20th century, the French Empire in Africa had grown vast, but it was no longer stable. Beneath the appearance of control, anger and resistance were spreading among African societies that had suffered years of forced labor, cultural suppression, and economic exploitation. After World War II, ideas of freedom and self-determination inspired powerful nationalist movements across French-controlled Africa. Maintaining such a massive empire through military force became increasingly difficult and costly for France. This growing resistance revealed the hidden weakness behind colonial power and prepared the ground for a final confrontation with the consequences of imperial ambition. The turning point of empire. As the 20th century progressed, the vast French Empire in Africa began to show visible cracks. What once appeared to be a symbol of strength and global dominance was increasingly challenged by African resistance, economic pressure, and international criticism. Educated African leaders, war veterans, and ordinary citizens started demanding rights, dignity, and self-rule after experiencing the contradictions of French promises of equality. Global opinion shifted against colonialism, and France found itself struggling to justify its control over millions of people across distant lands. This moment marked a critical turning point, where imperial power collided with the unstoppable desire for freedom, paving the way toward the consequences that would soon follow. Conclusion: power, pride, and consequences. France did not take so much of Africa by accident. It was a result of national ambition, strategic planning, military force, political manipulation. The borders drawn during French rule still affect Africa today, causing conflicts, economic struggles, and political instability. Understanding this history is essential because the past is not over. Its effects are still shaping the world we live in. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to a channel.